It's once you look at a globe that it becomes particularly easy to understand why the Arabs were such natural inheritors of Greek learning. From the Bronze Age onwards, there'd been a constant exchange of artifacts and information all across the Eastern Mediterranean. And in fact, a number of Greek ideas stem from Eastern and Egyptian influences. The bulk of this knowledge was preserved in the great schools and library at Alexandria. And then in 641 AD, the Arabs take over the city and, at a stroke, have direct access to this precious learning.
Many of these texts found their way to Fez. This is an Arabic translation of Aristotle with an additional commentary by the Muslim scholar Averroes.
The translation's done in Iraq, and then Averroes does this commentary in Al-Andalus.
There's even an early Arabic translation of the Bible.
So it's extraordinary, isn't it, that Arabic's the lingua franca, then everybody's writing in Arabic, even the Bible.
And thus ends the Gospel of Mark the Apostle.
The contrast with Europe at this time could not have been greater. Here, ancient Greek texts and the rational investigation they contained were often feared as blasphemous.
When the Prophet Muhammad was born, Christianity had already been battling with paganism for 600 years, trying to persuade believers to turn away from their old gods to the one new God. And because of that, Christians were often suspicious of Greek and Roman pagan texts. For instance, in 529 AD, the Christian emperor Justinian closed down the Athenian schools of philosophy.
Set against this vibrant Islamic culture, Europe can appear an introspective and intellectually cautious place. It was certainly a continent in crisis.
After the fall of Rome, there was a power vacuum in Europe, with rival tribes squabbling for territories. It was the start of what later Christian scholars would describe as the Dark Ages.
While Europe lay unprotected and vulnerable, Islam was consolidating land and power. By the beginning of the 8th century, the Arabs had converted the Berber tribes at the very tip of North Africa. And before long, troops were gathered on the coast, their eyes fixed on Europe.
This little stretch of water between Spain and Morocco is only 9 miles wide, but it's come to represent some kind of cultural chasm between Europe and Africa. But in the 8th century, when sea travel was the way to get around, that wasn't a barrier, it was a highway.
In July 711, 7,000 Berber tribesmen stormed across the Straits of Gibraltar and invaded Europe. The Muslims then began an incredible process of expansion. In just 4 years, they'd colonised almost the whole of Spain, had crossed the Pyrenees, and were only halted at Poitiers in France. Were it not for this reverse, an army which had swept across 2 continents might easily have crossed the English Channel and occupied Britain. The Muslims called the country they came to Al-Andalus, the land of the Vandals. This refers to the Germanic tribe who ruled Spain at the time, the Visigoths. Spanish historians have traditionally seen the Muslim invasion of Spain as a terrible and violent attack, an assault on Christian Europe. In fact, here at the Visigothic site of Rocopolis near Madrid, archaeologists have found evidence which offers a rather different explanation.
The city of Rocopolis In fact, was the royal city founded by the Visigoths in order to demonstrate the power of the new state. Dimensions were spectacular for this period. And this complex is the most important discovery in Western Europe.
What was it at the time that the Muslims were invading? What was the state of the city then?
They found it not only here in this part of Iberia, but in everywhere of the Al-Andalus. They founded cities in crisis. Social crisis, of urban crisis. The traditional explanation is this idea that when the Arabs came, the society collapses and the city collapses. It's not true. It's not true. The collapse of the city started during the Visigothic period.
If you read the Orthodox Spanish histories, then you'll learn that predatory Muslim hordes forcibly appropriated Visigothic Spain. And there certainly were some invasion battles. But at many places, like here at Rocopolis, it seems that the newcomers were actually welcomed with open arms. We even have treaties where the Visigoths enthusiastically hand over their land in return for effective Muslim protection. When you were excavating, did you find any evidence of violence at the time of the Arab invasion?
We don't have evidence of violence. Not at all. In this area was peaceful, and the archaeology is showing another landscape, another explanation too. The Muslims started to build a new society.
The enthusiasm for learning that the Islamic world had spent years nurturing was about to be transmitted to Europe.
We went into Spain not to fight against the people there, but to save them from the tyranny of the Latins and others that governed them at the time. In Al-Andalus, they found a paradise on earth. When the Arabs changed location, changed geography from their inhospitable, barren homeland, and moved to a rich and fertile country, this was to transform the Arab mind. This is the secret of how such a great civilization came to be born.
The foundations of a new society had been laid. A self-confident, progressive and sophisticated civilization had arrived among the failing states of Europe. And the continent's history was about to be transformed. The Muslim invasion of Spain had been swift and effective, but it lacked a strong leadership. The first wave of invaders were North African tribesmen, only recently converted to Islam, and without connections to the power base of Arabia. But this was about to change. In the capital of the Muslim world, a political coup left all the members of the ruling dynasty massacred. All that is except for one, a prince called Abd al-Rahman.
Abd al-Rahman was in his late teens when his family was massacred. He managed to escape the slaughter and fled to the hills west of Damascus.
His mother had been from North Africa, and Abd al-Rahman must have grown up hearing tales of Al-Andalus. And so he made a dangerous journey across the Nile and the deserts of Egypt, heading for those distant lands. Abd al-Rahman brought culture and learning from the centre of the Islamic world straight to the heart of Al-Andalus.
When Abd al-Rahman arrived in Spain, he came here to Cordoba, where the city was in complete disarray. That Roman bridge had collapsed into the river. But Abd al-Rahman set to rebuilding the city. You have to remember that it's in this context that the Arabs arrive, not as marauding destroyers, but sometimes as saviours.
Abderrahman brought cutting-edge technology for irrigation to Spain. Almost immediately, the landscape was transformed. Palm trees, lemon and orange groves, avocados, artichokes and pomegranates, none of which had been seen in Europe. Because of Abderrahman's sophisticated trade network, this new agriculture created huge wealth. And these riches were used to build one of the greatest cities in the world. While the inhabitants of London were still living in wooden houses, the people of Cordoba had built a cosmopolitan city with a population of over 100,000, the largest settlement in Europe. Reports from European visitors to Cordoba describe a city with 70 libraries and over 300 public baths. The accounts tell of houses with running water and roads illuminated by streetlights.
You often have to take medieval sources with a fairly substantial pinch of salt because chroniclers were extremely fond of exaggeration. But in fact, the new excavations here at Cordoba are actually revealing a city that was just as rich as the one that they described. These monumental palace walls belong to a Muslim aristocrat, and this channel over here is part of the water system that brought Cordoba its famously effective sewage works, as well as the fountains and the baths that so impressed all those European visitors.
Cordoba was described by a 10th century German visitor as the ornament of the world.
One of the reasons it's been so difficult to investigate Islamic Cordoba is that the city's been built up on itself like a kind of layer cake. But here, the archaeologists have taken away the modern level to reveal that Islamic layer there, and then down at the bottom, a Roman mosaic.
Abderrahman built Cordoba on top of what had been one of the largest cities in Roman Spain, outshining all that went before. And his greatest achievement was this: the Great Mosque of Cordoba. With a floor space the size of 4 football pitches, this is the largest mosque in Western Islam. The forest of 600 marble columns disappear into the distance, creating a mesmeric infinity effect. On the columns, arches balance on top of one another. Its shell-shaped prayer niche has an extraordinary acoustic, making any word spoken inside audible to the entire congregation.
When the mosque was first built, these archways would have been opened to allow people and light to stream in and out. And this courtyard was a central part of the complex. People would come here to ritually purify themselves before they worshipped, or just to gossip and do business.
Abderrahman's original mosque was only a fraction of the size of the building that stands today. Over a period of 200 years, rulers would extend the mosque 3 times. It's been suggested that the mosque was enlarged because each new ruler of the city wanted to stamp his authority on the building. But there's also a more straightforward explanation. The Cordoba Mosque had to accommodate the burgeoning number of worshippers. The Muslim population of Spain was growing fast. Modern Spain has been reluctant to acknowledge that its indigenous population converted to Islam in droves.
Standard history books present the Muslim occupation of Spain as something that was superficial, just a surface colonisation by an Arab elite, not a presence that had any kind of lasting impact on the bulk of the population. New archaeological evidence is turning that idea on its head.
All over Spain, cities like Cordoba were established. Even Madrid was founded by Muslims. The original Arab walls still stand behind the royal palace.
How far did Muslim communities spread through Spain?
We see remains dating from the time of the Al-Andalus almost everywhere, not only in the south of Spain, but also in other parts of Spain. There are emerging lots of sites, fortresses, villages, and cities, almost everywhere. People were Arabized, losing the form of Latin they were speaking until then, and they were Islamized in the sense that they dropped Christianity and converted to Islam in massive numbers, really.
Were these forced conversions, or was the idea of Islam particularly attractive?
It's always very difficult to say why someone converts to another religion, isn't it? But I think there's no evidence of any forced conversion at all. In a way, the Islamization and Arabization of territories like Al-Andalus is very similar to what happened to the Roman Empire, when people wanted to convert to the values and to the cultural values, to the religious values, and to the way of living of what seemed to be a civilization which had lots of advantages.
I think it's very easy to forget that at this moment in time, Islam is a culture of innovation, isn't it? As you said, it's drawing in ideas from the East.
It's a culture of phenomenal innovation. The opportunities of living because of the market, because of the trade relations and so on, which were much more interesting.
The Islamization of Spain did more than change the name of the god that people worshipped. People converted because this was a religion which had something to offer them. It had wealth, it had social structure, and it had intellectual power.
The Arabs brought in one innovation that did more than any other to change the cultural makeup of Europe. And it's this: paper. The idea almost certainly came from the Chinese via trade exchange, and it is revolutionary technology. Unlike parchment and vellum, it's cheap and it's easy to mass produce. And when the Arabs come to Spain, they start to open paper-making factories. Paper allows you to do three things very effectively. You can gather information, you can analyse and develop ideas in a very precise way, and then you can disseminate your newfound knowledge to a wider world. And in the 10th century, that was a potent mix.
Cordoba's love of books became legendary. Whilst the Royal Library of France contained 900 books in this period, just one of Cordoba's 70 libraries amassed over 500,000. These books contain some of the most sophisticated studies of astronomy in the world.
In Northern Europe at this time there is nothing, but there is nothing that can be considered the result of sophisticated astronomy.
Why do you think Muslim scholars were particularly interested in the heavens and the revolution of the stars?
I think they were interested in science in general terms. For example, calculating the sacred direction. If you have to say your prayers, you must face towards Mecca. Calculating the direction of Mecca from a given place is not so easy. It is a complicated mathematical problem for which the Arabs had exact solutions from the 9th century.
One of the ways in which the Muslims solved these problems was by developing a Greek instrument called the astrolabe. This is a calculator for telling the time of night or day. If it's lined up on a star above the horizon, the angle can be registered with a movable needle. The measurement is then transferred to the reverse side of the astrolabe, where a base plate represents the geographical location.